The deep, resonant dome hollow of the Abbey's great bronze bell vibrated through the stone floor of the guest cell, the sound traveling up through the legs of the cot and into Silas's bones before his mind had fully returned from the depths of a dreamless sleep. He lay still for several minutes, eyes fixed on the gray-white ceiling where the first pre-dawn light was beginning to define the grain of the mortar between the stones. The air in the cell was stationary and cool, a steady 18 degrees Celsius that felt heavy compared to the thin, sharp atmosphere of the high ridge. He rolled his weight to the side, this strong mattress responding with a rhythmic crinkle crunch that seemed loud in the absolute stillness of the north wing. Silas sat up, his movements slow and deliberate, feeling the familiar stiffness in his lower back and the slight ache in his knuckles, the occupational markers of a man who had spent 40 years persuading timber to take on new forms. He reached for his wool socks, the thick fibers making a soft scritch hush as he pulled them over his feet, the material providing an immediate, grounding warmth. His boots sat exactly where he had left them, the dark leather appearing almost black in the dim light, and he picked one up to inspect the soles for any signs of separation after the previous day's descent. The leather was dry now, the salt-rimed edges showing a pale white line that he would need to treat once he returned to his own hearth. He slid his feet into the boots, the internal structure of the heel making a firm thump shush as his weight settled. He did not lace them immediately. Instead, he stood and moved to the wash basin, where the water from the previous night remained still and silver. He plunged his hands into the cool liquid, the sound of the displacement a gentle glove slosh, and splashed his face until the last remnants of sleep were washed away. The scent of the lavender soap remained in the fibers of his towel, a clean, floral note that contrasted with the more familiar smells of damp earth and sawdust. Silas turned toward his pack, his mind already calculating the variables of the return journey. The ascent would be more demanding, a steady gain of 800 meters of elevation over the next 6 kilometers. He checked the contents of his small leather pouch, ensuring he had enough dried venison and hardtack to sustain the caloric output required for the climb. He sat back down on the stool and began the process of lacing his boots, a ritual of tension and release that he performed with the same care he gave to stringing a bow. The leather cords made a sharp snap tug as he tightened them across the bridge of his foot, followed by a rhythmic creak pull as he worked the laces through the brass eyelets. He tied the final knots with a secure, double-looped hitch, feeling the support of the high ankles like a second skin. Silas then reached for his outer layers, a series of wool and fur garments designed to trap air and regulate his body temperature through a process of thermal layering. He donned his heavy wool tunic, the fabric making a muffled wisp shush as it slid over his head, followed by his leather vest which fastened with a row of horn buttons that clicked together with a sequence of small tick-tock sounds. He felt the weight of the gear settling on him, a physical manifestation of his preparation. Before leaving the cell, he paused to perform a morning ritual of tool maintenance, even though he would not be carving until he reached the high ridge. He retrieved his small pocket whetstone and his primary whittling knife, the steel cool and gray in the morning light. He applied a single drop of oil to the stone, the liquid spreading in a slow, translucent circle, and began to move the blade in a figure-8 pattern. The sound was a steady, meditative shush, hic, shush, hic, shush, hic. This was the baseline frequency of his life, a rhythmic friction that spoke of readiness and respect for the material world. He wiped the blade clean on a scrap of leather, the surface of the steel reflecting the flickering light of the single candle like a dark mirror. He stowed the knife in its sheath, the click of the safety strap a final snap hush. Silas stood, shouldered his pack, and moved toward the door, his hand resting on the iron latch. The metal was cold, -2 degrees Celsius, a reminder that the world outside the stone walls was still gripped by the mountain winter. He pressed the latch down, the mechanism moving with a smooth, oiled clack-click, and stepped out into the corridor. The Abbey was waking up. He could hear the distant, rhythmic shuffle of sandaled feet and the low, melodic drone of the morning prayers drifting from the chapel. He did not join the brothers, preferring the solitary communion of the trail. He walked toward the main gate, his boots making a steady thud-tock against the flagstones, the sound echoing up into the vaulted ceiling. He passed through the inner courtyard where the frost lay thick on the herb garden, the dead stalks of rosemary and thyme appearing like silver sculptures in the dawn. The great oak gates were being opened by two younger monks, the massive timbers groaning on their hinges with a deep, vibratory creak rum that felt like a mountain shifting. Silas nodded to them, a silent gesture of gratitude, and stepped out into the valley. The air hit him like a physical force, a sharp, clarifying cold that tasted of pine needles and snow. The temperature outside the walls was -10 degrees Celsius, and the wind was a low-pitched rumsigh that carried the scent of the deep woods. He paused to secure his snowshoes, the ashwood frames making a sharp clack snap as he locked the bindings over his boots. He took up his ash staff, the metal tip making a crystalline talk as it hit the frozen ground. The journey back to the deep pines had begun. He moved with a steady, rhythmic gait, his snowshoes making a consistent crunch hiss as they broke the surface of the packed snow. The valley floor was a wide, white expanse, the Abbey buildings behind him shrinking into the gray landscape. Silas focused on the mechanics of his movement, the way his center of gravity shifted with every step to maintain maximum efficiency. He thought of the physics of his ascent, how much force was required to move his mass against the incline. The slope felt like it was at least 30 degrees, gravity acting against him and pulling him down as if his ascent was an affront to gravity's existence. He adjusted his pace to ensure his heart rate remained steady. He entered the first stand of trees at the edge of the pines, the transition from the open valley to the forest marked by a sudden, profound shift in acoustics. The wind was baffled by the dense canopy, and the sound of his movement became more intimate, a soft hush crunch that seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding timber. The trees here were mostly silver birch and younger maples, their bark tight and smooth, showing the first hints of the coming spring beneath the ice. Silas observed them with a technical eye, noticing the way the weight of the snow had caused some of the branches to bow in a perfect catenary curve. He moved deeper into the woods, the birch giving way to the massive, furrowed trunks of the ancient hemlocks and pines. These were the elders of the forest, their roots anchored deep in the granite bedrock of the mountain. The scent here was a complex mixture of damp earth, decaying needles, and the sharp, medicinal tang of hemlock resin. A sudden sound to his left caught his attention, a rapid-fire tap-tap-tock-tap, and he paused to see a pileated woodpecker working on a dead snag of cedar. The bird's movement was a blur of black and white, its beak striking the wood with a rhythmic force that sounded like a small hammer. Silas watched for a moment, appreciating the efficiency of the creature's labor, before continuing his climb. The terrain was beginning to steepen, the trail winding through narrow ravines where the snow had drifted into deep, treacherous banks. He used his staff to probe the depth of the powder, the wood making a muffled thump hiss as it disappeared into the drift. He navigated these sections with a calculated patience, seeking the firm ground near the base of the larger trees where the canopy had prevented the snow from accumulating. His breath was a steady, rhythmic pulse, a series of white plumes that vanished into the dark green of the branches. He reached a small clearing where a fallen giant, a white pine that must have stood for 200 years, lay across the path. The wood was shattered where it had hit the ground, the internal grain exposed to the elements. Silas knelt beside the break, his fingers tracing the growth rings. They were tight, indicating a long period of slow, steady growth, perhaps 5 rings per millimeter. The wood was dense and held a faint, sweet aroma that reminded him of the workshop. He thought of the potential within the fallen tree, the bowls, the spoons, the small vessels that could be birthed from this tragedy. He took his knife and carved a small splinter from the exposed heartwood, the sound a sharp screech, and held it to his nose. It was good timber, seasoned by the very air of the mountain. He stood and continued his ascent, the weight of his pack feeling more substantial as the incline increased. The rhythm of the snowshoes changed to a more deliberate stomp-hush, as he kicked steps into the steeper sections of the trail. He reached the halfway point of the climb, a rocky outcropping known as the Crow's Nest, which provided a view back toward the Abbey. The stone buildings were now tiny specks in the distance, the valley a map of whites and grays. The wind here was stronger, a constant whisk-shoe that tugged at his furs and made the needles of the surrounding pines sing in a high, mournful register. Silas took a moment to rest, leaning against the cold granite of the outcropping. He retrieved his flask and took a small sip of water, the liquid tasting of the cedar vessel and the mountain spring. He felt the cold penetrating his layers, a reminder that stillness was a danger in this environment. He pushed off from the rock and moved back into the shelter of the trees, the path narrowing as it hugged the side of the ridge. He was moving into the heart of the deep pines now, the area where the timber was the oldest and the silence the most profound. The trees here were spaced further apart, their trunks like the pillars of a great cathedral, the light filtering down in long, dusty shafts that caught the falling ice crystals. The sound of the forest was a low-frequency hum, a combination of the wind in the branches and the subtle movements of the earth. Silas felt a sense of homecoming as he navigated the familiar landmarks. The twisted oak that looked like a man in prayer, the twin birches that guarded the entrance to the high ravine, the flat stone where he had once found a cache of ancient flint tools. He was a part of this landscape, a living element of the high ridge ecology. He reached the upper plateau where the air grew thinner and the scent of the yew began to mingle with the pine. The terrain leveled out, allowing him to regain his rhythmic, steady pace. The snow here was wind-scoured and hard, making a crystalline click-clack under his snowshoes. He could see the distant peak of the high ridge, a white pyramid against the deepening blue of the afternoon sky. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, indigo shadows across the snow that distorted the features of the land. Silas moved with an unflagging focus, his mind already back in the workshop, planning the next project. He needed to prepare a new batch of linseed oil and beeswax, and the hearth would need to be cleared of ash before he could begin a new fire. The technical requirements of his life provided a structure that he found deeply comforting. He reached the final switchback before the workshop, a steep, icy stretch of trail that required the use of the metal spikes on his snowshoes. He kicked into the ice, the sound a series of sharp clack-talks that echoed off the rock face. He used his staff to pull himself upward, his muscles burning with the effort, his breath a ragged huff-puff in the cold air. He reached the top of the ridge and stood for a moment, surveying his domain. The workshop was a small, gray shadow in the distance, hunkered down against the wind. Silas moved toward it, his pace quickening as the proximity of home lent him a final burst of energy. The snowshoes made a rapid crunch as he crossed the open ridge, the wind whipping his cloak around his legs. He reached the door, the familiar grain of the oak a welcome sight, and retrieved the iron key from his pouch. The lock turned with a smooth, heavy clack-snick, and he stepped inside, closing the world out with a final, resonant thump-hush. The workshop was cold, 5 degrees Celsius, but it held the lingering scent of yew dust and pine resin, the perfumes of his labor. Silas set his pack down, the frame making a weary creak groan as it hit the floor. He moved to the hearth and began the process of building a fire, the ritual of the kindling and the flint a series of small, precise sounds, the clack of the stone, the shoo of the spark, the crackle pop of the dry wood catching. As the warmth began to bloom in the room, he sat on his stool and looked at his workbench, the empty space where the crozier had been a reminder of the task completed. He reached for a piece of scrap cedar and his small knife, the wood making a soft shush, hick as he began to take the first, exploratory shavings. The rhythm of the work was returning, the storyteller of the wood preparing for the next chapter. He watched the flames dance in the hearth, their light reflecting in the polished steel of his tools, and felt the deep, rooted rest of a man who was exactly where he was meant to be. The mountain outside continued its ancient, icy dialogue, but here, in the circle of the firelight, there was only the steady, rhythmic sound of the knife against the wood, a heartbeat of creation in the heart of the winter. Silas worked for hours, the pile of cedar shavings growing at his feet, each one a thin, fragrant curl of history. He thought of the forest he had just traversed, the fallen giant, the woodpecker, the silent hemlocks, and he realized that the wood did not just provide his material, it provided his language. He was not just carving timber, he was carving time itself, giving shape to the slow, patient energy of the high ridge. The workshop grew warmer, the temperature rising to a comfortable 20 degrees Celsius, and Silas felt the tension of the journey finally leave his body. He set the knife down and leaned back, his eyes fixed on the rafters, listening to the wind as it whistled through the cedar shingles. It was a familiar song, one that he had heard 1,000 times before, yet it always seemed to have something new to say. He closed his eyes for a moment, the rhythm of his breathing matching the pulse of the fire, and felt the profound, silent connection between his hands and the earth. This was the ritual of the rooted rest, the understanding that every labor requires a pause, every creation a moment of stillness. He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the stars that were now brilliant and cold above the peaks. The mountain was a silent sentinel, a witness to his work and his rest. Silas returned to his stool and picked up the wood once more, the sound of the knife a steady shush, picked in the quiet room, a small, persistent note of human intent in the vast, elemental symphony of the night. The first light of the new day was a soft, charcoal gray that seeped through the frost on the windows, illuminating the workshop with a dim, underwater glow that felt heavy with the silence of the high ridge. Silas stirred from his sleep, his body feeling the cumulative weight of the mountain journey, a deep-seated ache in his joints that reminded him of the relentless pull of the earth. He rose with a slow, deliberate effort, feeling like Atlas bearing the invisible burden of the mountain itself upon his shoulders, every movement a calculated negotiation with the force of gravity. He moved to the hearth, the air in the room a steady 10 degrees Celsius, and began the ritual of the morning fire. He laid the small shavings of cedar he had carved the night before into a nest of dry moss, the wood making a soft rustle hush as it settled. He struck the flint, the metallic clack producing a shower of bright orange sparks that caught the tinder, the flames beginning to climb with a gentle crackle pop that filled the room with a blooming, resinous warmth. Silas stood and looked at his workbench, the empty space where the enclosure had rested now filled with a sense of potential and a quiet, lingering ghost of the ancient timber. His mind returned to the fallen giant he had encountered in the deep pines, the massive white pine that had lived for 2 centuries before the weight of the storm brought it to the earth. There was an emotional gravity to that tree, a history written in its growth rings that Silas felt a profound need to honor. He gathered his heavy tools, focusing first on the long-handled felling axe with its head of forged carbon steel and a handle of second-growth hickory that he had carved himself 7 years ago. He ran his calloused thumb along the edge, feeling the microscopic teeth of the metal, ensuring it was keen enough to bite through the frozen sapwood. Beside it, he laid the massive 7-foot crosscut saw, its teeth set in a champion pattern designed to clear the heavy, wet sawdust of the deep pines. The steel was cold, negative 8 degrees Celsius, and it hummed with a low-frequency vibration as he checked its tension. He prepared his pack with extra care, including a thick leather harness and a coil of hemp rope that had been treated with linseed oil to prevent it from snapping in the sub-zero temperatures. The air outside was sharp and clarifying, a physical presence that bit into his lungs as he stepped over the threshold and into the vast, blinding white of the ridge. The snow was deep and untouched, a landscape of crystalline structures that recorded his every step with a rhythmic crunch hiss as he made his way back down toward the timberline. The descent required a constant awareness of the terrain, his ash staff probing the depths of the drifts to avoid the hidden hollows created by the sprawling roots of the mountain hemlocks. He reached the fallen giant, the tree looking even more immense in the stark, shadowless light of the morning. Its bark was a map of deep furrows and ridges, a landscape of texture that had weathered 200 winters and seen the passing of generations. Silas knelt beside the trunk, his hand resting on the wood, feeling a strange, quiet connection to the life that had been extinguished by the storm's fury. He began the process of clearing the snow from the harvest site, his shovel making a steady, metallic scrape hush against the frozen ground until the bark of the main trunk was fully exposed. He measured 3 feet from the base, marking the wood with a small notch from his pocket knife. He then positioned the crosscut saw, his feet braced against the granite outcropping to provide the necessary leverage. He began to saw, the long blade making a rhythmic swish-tock as it bit into the frozen timber. Each stroke was a study in endurance, the saw pulling through the dense fibers of the pine with a stubborn resistance that required him to engage every muscle in his back and shoulders. The scent of the pine was overwhelming, a sharp, sweet explosion of resin that filled the air and coated his senses in a sticky, aromatic film. He watched the growth rings reveal themselves as the blade moved deeper into the heartwood, each line a record of a specific year, a narrow ring for a drought, a wide, healthy ring for a rainy summer. He counted them in his mind, feeling the passage of time as a tangible, physical experience. It took him nearly 2 hours to cut through the massive diameter, the final separation marked by a deep, resonant thump that vibrated through the snow and into the soles of his boots. He then began the arduous task of moving the log onto his heavy ash sled. He used the long timber lever to pry the section upward, though making a slow, wet-grown creak as it shifted. Every inch was a battle against the earth's pull, a demonstration of the Atlas-like effort required to master such a heavy material. He secured the log to the sled with a hemp rope, the knots tightening with a satisfying snap. The pull back up the high ridge was the most demanding labor of his life. He leaned into the leather harness, his body nearly parallel to the slope, his boots kicking deep steps into the hard-packed snow. The weight of the pine log was an anchor, a gravitational force that demanded total presence and absolute focus. He could feel the blood pulsing in his temples, a rhythmic beat that matched the slow, deliberate pace of his ascent. He did not look at the top of the ridge. He focused only on the next step, the next breath, the next inch of progress. The air grew thinner as he climbed, the temperature dropping to -12 degrees Celsius as the sun began its slow descent. He reached the halfway point, the crow's nest outcropping, and paused to catch his breath. His lungs burned with the cold, but he felt a strange, fierce joy in the exertion. He looked down at the sled, the raw heartwood of the pine glowing like a beacon against the gray snow, and he knew the effort was worth the reward. He pushed off again, his muscles screaming with the effort, his mind focused on the image of the workshop hearth. He reached the upper plateau just as the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening blue of the sky. The final stretch to the workshop was a test of his remaining strength, the sled runners making a heavy scree-hush as they moved across the wind-scoured ice. He reached the door, his hand shaking as he turned the iron key in the lock, the mechanism moving with a heavy clack-snip. He dragged the sled inside, the warmth of the room hitting him like a physical wave, and he collapsed onto his stool for a moment of recovery. The workshop was 12 degrees Celsius, but to Silas, it felt like a summer afternoon. After a few minutes of rest, he moved the log from the sled to the center of the floor, the wood settling with a final, grounding thud. He spent the next hour debarking the log with his long draw knife, the blade moving in a steady, wet shoo that revealed the pristine, cream-colored sapwood. He felt a deep, quiet satisfaction in the work, an emotional resonance that he had not expected. This tree had been a landmark of the forest, a silent witness to the passing of time, and now it was becoming a part of his own history. He thought of the communal table he would carve from it, a place where people like Julian or the brothers from the Abbey could gather and share their stories. It was a shift from the solitary labor of the crozier to something that belonged to the world. He moved to his heavy chisels, beginning the process of roughing out the massive, hollowed-out basin that would form the base of the table. The sound was a steady shush, hic, shush, hic, as he worked with the grain, the wood yielding in long, fragrant curls that piled up around his boots like a golden shroud. The night deepened, the shadows in the workshop stretching and dancing in the light of the fire. Silas worked with a rhythmic focus, the tension of the day beginning to settle into a productive, meditative flow. He was not rushing to finish. He was simply beginning the long dialogue with the wood. He spent hours refining the shape, his mind wandering through the possibilities of the new work, the characters he had yet to meet, and the stories that were still unwritten. The workshop grew warmer, the temperature rising to a comfortable 21 degrees Celsius, and the scent of the pine was thick and intoxicating, a sensory anchor that kept him rooted in the present. He eventually set his tools down, the metal meeting the bench with a final clink, and looked at the raw, massive potential of the pine. It was enough for today. He moved to the hearth and added a final log of oak, the wood catching with a deep, vibratory drum hush that signaled the end of the day's labor. He prepared a simple meal of rye bread and salted butter, eating in the absolute silence of the ridge. He felt the profound, silent connection between his hands and the earth, a sense of belonging that required no words. He moved to his cot, the straw mattress making a soft, crinkle crunch as he settled into the heavy wool blankets. The room was dark, the only light the dying embers of the fire, and the cold brilliance of the stars outside the window. Silas felt the weight of the mountain finally release its hold on his muscles, replaced by a warm, drifting fatigue that pulled him down into the soft, dark earth of sleep. He thought of the forest, the Abbey, the yew, and the pine, all of them part of a single, unfolding narrative of creation and rest. He was the woodcarver, the storyteller of the high ridge, and his work was a testament to the enduring power of the rooted life. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to a steady, oceanic rhythm that matched the pulse of the mountain. The shadows on the wall were still, the tools were silent on the bench, and the fire was a fading, golden heartbeat in the corner of the room. Silas felt the boundaries of his consciousness begin to dissolve, the workshop and the ridge fading into the vast, silent dark of the winter night. He was home, he was whole, and he was at rest. And in that quietude he slept.